My name is Grace Holloway, and I'm 29 years old. 3 months ago, my parents looked me in the eye and handed me a house that was literally falling apart. Cracked walls, rotting floors, and no running water. While my twin sister, Sydney, received a brand new $550,000 luxury penthouse downtown. I did not argue. I took the rusty keys, drove a long drive out to the North Carolina coast, and I rebuilt that ruin with my own 2 hands. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a message letting me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. The salt air hit me. Before the gravel stopped crunching under my tires, I stepped out of the truck and looked at it. My legacy, my head start. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat on the edge of the dunes, leaning into the wind like a wounded animal. The cedar shingles were gray and brittle, curling away from the walls. The porch was a collection of splinters, held together by luck and sea salt. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the sting of betrayal. Instead, I pulled a clipboard and a laser measure from my bag. I am a landscape architect. I see structures not for what they are, but for what they can be forced to become. Inside, the damage was clinical. Termite damage in the subfloor, mold growing like a map of my family's neglect in the kitchen corners, no running water. The pipes were choked with rust and sand. My father, Gary, a man who built his career as a chief financial officer, had calculated that this place would swallow me whole. He figured I'd come crawling back to the penthouse within a week, begging for a room in Sydney's shadow. What he didn't account for was my private balance sheet. He didn't know about the $25,000 I had scraped together over 3 years of freelance design work and missed vacations. That money wasn't for a house. It was for an exit strategy. I sat on the warped floorboards and stared at the ceiling. People asked why I didn't fight back at that mahogany table, why I took the rusty keys and just walked away. They don't understand the survivor's invisible chain. When you grow up as the twin who is useful while the other is adored, you learn to stop fighting for space. You start building your own. For 29 years, I had been the silent investor in my parents' version of family. I was the one who fixed the glitches in Sydney's image. I was the one who stayed quiet, so Gary's ego could stay loud. I had been wearing a chain made of their expectations and my own silence for so long that I'd forgotten how heavy it was. This ruin wasn't a punishment. It was a trade. I would trade my savings and my sweat for a space where they had no authority. Every board I replaced was a link in that chain I was cutting. Every bucket of moldy drywall I hauled to the dump was a piece of their control I was throwing away. I spent the first night on a sleeping bag in the middle of the living room. The wind howled through the gaps in the window frames, but it was the first time in my life I didn't hear the noise of their disapproval. This wasn't a home yet. It was a fortress of my own making. And for the first time, I was the one holding the blueprints. I spent the next 3 weeks stripping the past off the walls, literally. As I scraped layers of salt-damaged paint and hauled away truckloads of debris, I found myself tallying the debt. Not the debt my parents claimed I owed them for the privilege of being their daughter, but the debt they owed me. In my family, compassion was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. For most of my adult life, I had been the invisible infrastructure that kept the Holloway name from collapsing. 3 years ago, when my father, Gary, was hit with a federal audit during his final year as a chief financial officer, the golden child, Sydney, was in Bali finding herself. I was the one in the basement office in Charlotte, breathing in dust and ink for 16 hours a day. I was the one reconstructing 3 years of expense reports to prove he hadn't committed felony embezzlement. I saved his career and his freedom. All I got in return was a cold. Don't mention this to your mother. Then there was the private family lien Gary invented. He convinced me that he had taken out a high-interest private loan to cover grandma's medical bills and keep the cottage from being seized years ago. He told me that if I didn't pay him $2,000 a month to service the debt, the house would be lost forever. I was paying him to save a legacy that, unbeknownst to me, he had already stolen. Then there was the property tax. When Gary's accounts were frozen during the investigation, the family home was 10 days away from a tax lien. I took $15,000 I'd saved from my own down payment and wired it to the county clerk without a second thought. I didn't ask for a thank you note. I asked for a seat at the table. I should have known then that love in the Holloway house wasn't a feeling. It was a transaction where I was always the one providing the liquidity. I looked at my hands. They were covered in blisters, sea salt, and gray dust. As a landscape architect, I spend my days designing high-end outdoor spaces for people who want to pretend they're in a paradise. My hands are my tools. They are thrashed, calloused, and efficient. I am an expert at reclamation. I spend my career making broken land look intentional. I checked my phone, and a new notification popped up on Sydney's feed. She was standing on the balcony of her brand new $550,000 penthouse, holding a designer bag that probably cost more than my first truck. The caption said, "Finally found my space." Blessed and manifested. The contrast was clinical. Sydney's life was a stage set, decorated with my silence and Gary's guilt. She had never worked a 40-hour week in her life. Her influencer career was a subscription service that I had been unknowingly funding with my own missed opportunities. Every time I stepped in to cover a family emergency or fix a complication for her, I was just adding another zero to their balance sheet. But as I hammered a fresh nail into the new subfloor, the sound was final. That tax payment, that audit, that was the last time I'd be the invisible infrastructure. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long. Gary and Stephanie thought they were giving me a pile of trash to keep me busy and remind me of my place. They didn't realize that by giving me this ruin, they had finally given me the one thing I actually needed, an invoice they couldn't ignore. I wasn't just building a house, I was closing an account. And by the time the sun set on this coast, the Holloway family was going to realize they were officially bankrupt. 800 hours later, the lighthouse cottage didn't just stand, it breathed. The salt-crusted ruin I had inherited was gone, replaced by a structure that held the weight of the coast with quiet authority. I had restored the original cedar siding, reclaimed the heart pine floors, and installed a landscape of native, salt-tolerant flora that made the dunes look intentional. But more importantly, I had secured the official historical heritage certificate. The cottage was no longer just a building, it was a landmark. I was standing on the porch, finishing the final coat of sealant on the railing, when I heard the hum of a German-engineered engine. My father, Gary, pulled into the gravel drive in his black sedan. My mother, Stephanie, sat in the passenger seat, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. They didn't step out of the car with smiles or bottles of champagne. They stepped out with the clinical posture of auditors. Gary didn't say he was proud. He didn't mention the 800 hours of sweat I had poured into every joint and joist. He walked through the front door without knocking and performed a slow, silent walkthrough. He ran his hand over the white oak cabinets I had built. He checked the seal on the new windows. He looked at the historical heritage plaque I had mounted near the fireplace. It wasn't a visit, it was an appraisal. "The place looks functional," Gary said, his voice flat stripped of any fatherly warmth. He stood in the center of the living room I had rebuilt and looked at me as if I were a contractor who had just finished a job. "We've been reviewing the family's consolidated assets, Grace. Things have changed." I wiped the dust from my hands and leaned against the counter. "What kind of changes, Gary?" He didn't flinch at me using his name. To him, we were in a boardroom now. Sydney's situation in Charlotte has reached a critical threshold. Her influencer partnerships have collapsed, and the $550,000 penthouse is being reclaimed by the bank. She's currently $125,000 in debt with no liquid assets to cover the margin. Stephanie stepped forward, her voice taking on that rehearsed, placating tone she used whenever they were about to liquidate my interest to save Sydney. "Honey, your sister's in a very dark place. She needs a fresh start. Somewhere quiet, somewhere that reflects the family status." I looked at the walls I had sanded until my fingers bled. "She has a fresh start. It's called a job. Why are you telling me this?" Gary's jaw tightened. He pulled a folder from under his arm. The penthouse was a mistake. This house, however, is now a certified heritage asset. It has value. It has a story. Your mother and I have decided that the best move for the Holloway legacy is for Sydney to take over this property. She can use the heritage status to rebrand her image. It's a recovery play. He set the folder on my counter. "The deed is still in my name. I am the primary stakeholder. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." We've already arranged for a moving crew to arrive on Thursday morning. We'll make it up to you eventually, but right now, the family needs this house for Sydney. 48 hours. They were giving me 48 hours to hand over 800 hours of my life and $25,000 of my savings so Sydney could have a scenic backdrop for her bankruptcy. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I just stared at the man who had taught me that family was a contract, realizing he was the one who had just breached it. I looked at my father and said 5 words. I need to make a phone call. I didn't answer Gary's text at midnight. I didn't waste my breath arguing that family shouldn't evict family. That would be an emotional response, and I was done with those. Instead, I called Marcus Webb. He's been my closest friend since we were 18, but tonight, I didn't need a friend. I needed the sharpest real estate attorney in the state of North Carolina. Marcus, I said, my voice as cold and clinical as a forensic accountant. Gary is trying to liquidate my interest. He says the deed is in his name. He gave me 48 hours to vacate. Marcus didn't sound surprised. He sounded ready. Grace, I've been waiting for you to let me help. I ran a title search the day you moved out there. I didn't want to overstep, but Gary's numbers never added up. I'm sending a file to your secure server now. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, statutes, and quiet retribution. Gary had lied. He didn't own the cottage. He didn't own the dunes. He didn't own a single grain of sand on this coast. The land was held in an ironclad revocable living trust, established in 2012 by my grandmother, Lorraine Price. The trustee was Lorraine. The sole beneficiary listed on the notarized deed? Me. I sat on the heart pine floorboards I had just polished, my back against the cabinets I had built with my own hands. I realized then that my father had used my own integrity against me. For 5 years, Gary had told me Grandma was diminished. He said she was losing her margin and that calling her would only overdraft her mental health. He used my love for her as a firewall to keep me from the truth. Grace, listen to me, Marcus said, his voice sharp with professional indignation. I dug into the county correspondence logs. There have been 5 separate certified letters sent to your old address regarding the Price Estate Trust. Gary signed for all of them. He's been intercepting your mail for half a decade. The betrayal wasn't a sudden spike. It was a systematic embezzlement of my life. Gary had been waiting. He knew Grandma Lorraine wanted me to have the lighthouse cottage. He waited until it was a ruin, so I would spend my $25,000 in savings to fix it. He waited until I secured the historical heritage certificate because he knew exactly what that piece of paper unlocked. It wasn't just about a house for Sydney. The heritage status triggered an automatic state conservation grant worth $50,000 a year, every year, for 30 years. Gary was a chief financial officer to his core. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a high-yield asset that he could work for free and then reclaim once the profit margin was high enough. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was criminal fraud. My father hadn't just been cold. He had been calculated. I looked at the trust documents. My name printed in bold, undeniable ink. Gary thought he had 48 hours to move me out. He didn't realize that in 48 hours, I would be the one serving him an invoice he couldn't survive. Marcus didn't just file paperwork. He contacted the local sheriff's department. Because Gary's actions involved federal mail fraud and felony title theft, this wasn't a standard civil eviction. It was an emergency criminal intervention. The sheriff was already stationed at the edge of my property, waiting for the signal that the documents had been served. I walked through the kitchen I built at exactly 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of catering and desperation. Sydney was standing in the center of the living room, her phone mounted on a ring light, narrating her manifested success to 10,000 strangers. Gary was leaning against the white oak mantel I had painstakingly restored, holding a glass of scotch like he had just closed the deal of the century. When they saw me, the performance faltered. Gary checked his watch and told me I was out of time, calling me a contractor who didn't know when to leave. That was the moment the front door opened. Grandma Lorraine walked in, her silver hair pinned back with iron precision, her grip on her cane unwavering. Marcus followed her, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the end of my father's career. The room went cold. Gary tried to play the concerned son, but Grandma looked past him as if he were a bad line entry on a balance sheet. She asked him one question that landed like a gavel. Gary, whose land do you think you're standing on? Marcus opened the briefcase and slid the notarized trust documents onto the counter. The silence wasn't just quiet, It was the sound of an entire family's leverage being liquidated in real time. My father's face turned the color of a failed audit. He looked at the papers, then at the daughter he had tried to erase, and realized he was standing in a fortress he had no key for. I watched them, my parents and my sister, and I realized they were suffering from the illusion of the empty wallet. For decades, they had built their authority on a foundation of borrowed prestige and my invisible labor. They had confused a high credit limit with actual character. They thought that because they had the Penthouse and the designer labels, they were superior beings. But now that the accounts were frozen and the title was clear, the mask was gone. Without my money and my silence to prop them up, Gary and Stephanie weren't powerful. They were just small, dishonest people, standing in a house that belonged to the daughter they had called a burden. Sydney started to scream about her career and her followers, her face contorted with a rage that had no market value. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply handed Gary the white envelope containing the formal restraining order and an itemized invoice for $121,000. This was the total of the $96,000 in debt payments I had been defrauded into paying him over 4 years, plus the $25,000 of my own savings I had invested into the property's restoration. I looked my father in the eye and delivered the finisher. I told him that I was done being the silent investor in his version of family. I was no longer a resource he could overdraft. I told them to take their balloons in their empty boxes and vacate my property. As they filed out into the salt air, leaving their fake celebration behind, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced. This wasn't revenge. It was a final accounting. The fall of the Holloway house was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, calculated liquidation. My father's reputation as a top-tier chief financial officer didn't just crack, it evaporated, as word of the Price Estate trust fraud spread through his former professional circles. Gary and Stephanie were forced to sell the $550,000 penthouse to cover the $121,000 in restitution they owed me, along with the mounting legal fees from the state investigation into the intercepted trust documents. Last I heard, they had moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of the city, a far cry from the lakefront district they used to call home. Sydney's fate was the most clinical of all. Without my invisible labor to fix her glitches, or Gary's capital to fund her aesthetics, her influencer brand became a hollow shell. She tried to rebrand herself as a survivor of family betrayal, but even her 10,000 followers could see through a performance that had no market value. She's now working a standard entry-level marketing job, finally learning the definition of a 40-hour week. I didn't use the $96,000 Gary paid back to buy a new car or a faster boat. Instead, I used it along with the first year of the $50,000 conservation grant to establish the Price Heritage Fund. The fund is dedicated to supporting young architects and designers who have been marginalized or silenced by their own circumstances. We provide grants, mentorship, and most importantly, a space where their work is recognized as a career, not a hobby. The Lighthouse Cottage is now the headquarters for the fund. I spend my mornings on the porch, watching the tide come in, and my afternoons in the studio I built in the old keeper's quarters. The marigolds Grandma Lorraine and I planted are thriving in the salt air. For the first time in 29 years, the silence in my home isn't the sound of suppression, it is the sound of peace. I have stopped waiting for my family to see my worth because I am too busy building it for myself. To those of you listening who've ever been treated like a footnote in your own family story, I want to say this: you are not a burden and you are not an afterthought. If you are the one always gathering the pieces, the one expected to absorb the blows so others can stay comfortable, know that your silence is your liquidity. You do not owe anyone a version of yourself that makes their life easier at the cost of your own. Your hands know things your head hasn't figured out yet. Start building your own lighthouse. You don't need their permission to be luminous. If my story gave you the courage to set a boundary or value your own sweat, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss our next journey toward justice.